Guests and friends, welcome to the Henry Ford Museum of American Innovation. Please silence all cell phones and welcome President and CEO of the Henry Ford, Patricia Mouradian.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and I hope you all had a wonderful holiday weekend. I am so honored to be here today with all of you and to welcome you to this very special event. Thank you for attending. As you all know, your support makes programs like this possible. Very inspiring to see all of you here, and we could not do the work we do without all of you participating with us. Thank you. I especially want to thank our distinguished panelists, Dr. Jeanne Theoharis, Mrs. Dorothy Dewberry Aldridge, and our Curator of Black History, Amber Mitchell. We have several members of Mrs. Rosa Parks' family here this afternoon. We want to welcome all of you. Thank you for being here. And we're also joined by local civil rights activists John Hardy, Martha Prescott, Norman Noonan, and Reverend Daniel Aldridge, Mrs. Aldridge's husband, and we're joined by their daughter, Shaylin Aldridge. Thank you. So we are here today to mark the 69th anniversary of Rosa Parks' arrest when she refused to give up her seat to a white man on a Montgomery city bus on December 1st, 1955. That bus, on which Mrs. Parks sparked a new era in the American quest for freedom and equality, is considered one of the most significant artifacts of the American civil rights movement. And we are very humbled and honored to have it here at the Henry Ford Museum of American Innovation on permanent exhibition, just steps away from where we are now. At the Henry Ford, we believe that these historical objects hold power. They hold stories about movements and moments that changed history forever. And it's very important that we use the opportunity to learn from these objects in order to make a better future. That's why we do the work that we do. And we gather here this afternoon not only to honor Mrs. Parks' legacy and her place in American history, but to talk about what her courage truly means today and what we can do to continue in her footsteps. Her work was so important. Dr. Jeanne Theoharis, the author of The Rebellious Life of Mrs. Parks, and Dorothy Dewberry Aldridge, a native Detroit civil and human rights advocate who fought besides Mrs. Parks, will be joined for a panel discussion led by our curator, Amber Mitchell, and they will further contextualize the growing freedom struggle in Detroit, as well as Mrs. Parks' lifelong dedication to activism. But first, I invite you to enjoy a special screening, you see the screen here behind me, of the adapted documentary of Dr. Theoharis' political biography of Mrs. Parks. This will document her historic role in the Montgomery bus boycott and her work in politics alongside Congressman John Conyers in Detroit and the many causes along the way, such as the voting rights and reparations that she fearlessly championed until her death in 2005. Then after the panel discussion, Dr. Theoharis will sign special 10th anniversary editions of her book, The Rebellious Life of Mrs. Rosa Parks, for purchase. This event marks the first time this book edition is available to the public. So thank you all for choosing to join your Sunday afternoon with us. I encourage all of you to take a look at your program. I brought mine up here to share with you because on the back of the program, there's a little bit of a paragraph about the Jackson House, which I'm sure a lot of you have been learning about and hearing about, and I encourage you to get involved in our efforts to preserve the Jackson House, the Selma, Alabama home that became a safe haven where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and others worked, collaborated, strategized, and planned the Selma to Montgomery March of 1965, just a mere 10 years after Rosa Parks did what she did in 1955. With this project, the Henry Ford has an opportunity to inspire and to educate that next generation of young people, people of all ages that we call change makers, change agents, innovators in our society, hoping that they can continue to fight for what is right in this country. The house relocated to Greenfield Village this year and will open to the public in 2026. So, without further ado, I would like you all to watch the film. Thank you all for being here.
Please welcome Amber Mitchell, Curator of Black History for the Henry Ford.
Alrighty, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for hanging in there in terms of getting through the documentary, a wonderful documentary. I hope you all have learned more than I have, as well as just really gotten the energy of Mrs. Parks on today, which is Rosa Parks Day, of course, December 1. It is my honor and privilege to serve as your moderator for today's event, and it is my extreme pleasure to be able to share a stage with such illustrious company. And so without further ado, I would love to introduce to each of you our panelists for this afternoon's conversation. On our to your far right and my far left, we have Dr. Jeanne Theoharis, author of The Rebellious Life of Mrs. Rosa Parks. And in the center, we have a Detroit's civil and human rights legend, Mrs. Dorothy Dewberry Aldridge. And so, in the interest of time, we're going to head right on to it, right? Because there is so much to discuss after such an important film and, of course, an important moment in the history of our community and of our country. And so, Mrs. Aldridge, I'm going to start with you, okay? So we talked a lot about in this, in the film about, obviously, Mrs. Parks' activism throughout how many decades, at least 6 decades beyond, over the course of her life. But I think we talk a little bit less about what was going on in Detroit around 1950s, 1960s, and of course beyond, that motivates and inspires the sort of activism that drew Mrs. Parks into the work that was happening here when she moved up from Montgomery. So I'd like for you to describe for us what life was like for Black people in Detroit during this time, especially the tactics and structure of segregation that you and your husband, Reverend Aldridge, fought against during this critical period.
Well, certainly Detroit is a big, active city, largely African American, but that does not mean we didn't have segregation. And the city is still segregated. African Americans live on one side of town, white people live on the other side of town. At the time in the 60s, we had what was called police brutality. And that was a big issue in Detroit, particularly around 1960, 1963. There were, like I said, police brutality, particularly toward the young men. And Detroit had what they called at the time the Big Four, and they somehow or other they found the biggest, hugest white men they could find, and 4 of them would ride around in a big car and tell the young men, "This is my corner, and when I come back, I don't want to see you there." So the young men would scatter, and this went on for years until Coleman Young came to power.
Yes, ma'am. And around this time, you're also very active and growing active, as starting out working with the NAACP Youth Council, becoming active in SNCC. Could you describe for us your activism and how you started as a very young person during this time?
Well, yes, actually, I began my activism about 1965 with the NAACP Youth Council, the Triple City branch, meaning I was living downriver, and we would, River Rouge, Ecorse, and Southwest Detroit branches of the NAACP. And at that time, of course, we're hearing about what's going on in the South. We're hearing about Emmett Till. We're hearing about the Montgomery bus boycott. And so all of these things, and we're also hearing about lunch counter sit-ins in the South. And we would have sympathy bus boycotts up here, meaning if they were boycotting Woolworths in the South, then we would boycott Woolworths on Woodward Avenue. And so that's how my activism began, and I began also with the Northern Student Movement in the early 1960s, and we had what we call a tutorial project, bringing young people from the suburbs to the housing projects in the city. And so that was very successful. And a lot of the young people who I worked with from the tutorial project, I see still, and I'm still in touch with them, and they also, began their activism. And it went on from there. So in I then went into the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in 1964 because of the Mississippi Summer Project. And that's where there were a lot of voting rights projects in Mississippi, and a lot of other things, voting rights, and a lot of folks were thrown off the land for attempting to vote in 1964. So the northern student offices sent down monies and all kinds of supplies to the South in the 1964. And we recruited students to go down to the South and participate in what we called freedom schools. That was a very significant and successful project. And also we had, that's where I met Mrs. Parks, actually. She came to the SNCC office about 1963 or 4, and she would put together packages and things to go to support the 1964 voting rights program in Mississippi.
So, Dr. Theoharis, could you talk a little bit more about Mrs. Parks's real activism, especially as it comes to uplifting youth voices, right? I think one of the most critical things that we learned from the documentary, and of course from your book, is how critical she thought making sure that the torch that she was lighting was getting passed to the next generation. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, this is it. So first, I just wanted to say thank you. It's wonderful to be here, to be celebrating Rosa Parks Day here in Detroit. Like Amber, you were saying, I think we tend to talk more about Montgomery and less about her work in Detroit, even though she spends more than half her life in Detroit. So her commitment to young people, we absolutely see beginning in Montgomery. And we saw her, she joins the NAACP in 1943. She becomes active with E.D. Nixon, and they're trying things and they're doing things over and over and over. And she talks about how discouraging this work is, right? And fighting and fighting and that things aren't changing. And so in 1954, she founds the youth branch of the Montgomery chapter. And we saw some of the members of her youth chapter in the film, like Doris Crenshaw. And in part, she does this because, in her words, she is feeling like her peers are too complacent, and so she begins to kind of want to cultivate the next generation. And she loves the spirit and the energy and the militancy of young people, how they want to get things done. Her youth council, they organize a read-in the downtown public library because the downtown public library in Montgomery doesn't won't loan books to Black people. So she's doing this work. And when she comes home, we saw her go to Highlander, to that adult organizer training school the summer before she makes her bus stand. And the last day, like any good organizer training school, they say, "What are you going to do when you go home?" And Mrs. Parks says, "There's never going to be a mass movement in Montgomery. White violence is too great, and Black people aren't united. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go home and keep working with the young people." And when she gets home, she tells E.D. Nixon that she's both really inspired by her work at Highlander, so she sort of redoubles that effort. And her young people, when she gets arrested, one of my favorite quotes from her is she talks about how annoying it is. And she's irritated that she's gotten herself arrested. This is not her first bus stand. She's been kicked off the bus before because she refuses the practice of many bus drivers that would make Black people pay in the front, but then get off and reboard in the back. And she refused to do that. So she'd been thrown off the bus by this very bus driver and other bus drivers. So there's nothing to suggest that, when she decides to take her stand, she both understands that she could be hurt or killed, but also James Blake, the bus driver, makes a decision that day. When he'd thrown her off the bus before, he hadn't had her arrested, but he decides to have her arrested that day. And she's annoyed in some ways by this because she's planning this big workshop for her youth council that Saturday. And she's been planning it, and she has all this work to do that night. And then she's very discouraged on Saturday because only a couple of her young people come. And what she doesn't realize at the time is they're actually out leafleting because she had taught them well, and they are sort of readying, and they're passing out the leaflets and they're getting people ready. So I think we see that commitment even before the boycott. But then we see it again, right? And we turn to Detroit and the ways that she loves the kind of militancy of what we now call Black Power, that she joins with so many different Black Power movements. We heard Ed Vaughn in the film, and when I interviewed Mr. Vaughn, he told me he'd be like, I would go somewhere and they'd be like, "Dang, that's Rosa again." And she was just everywhere, he said, at all these Black Power events, both in his store, around police brutality, around political prisoners, around voting rights, around reparations, and on and on. And that, again, that energy, that militancy, right, is where she gravitates. And then certainly when she founds her institute, right, that it is about then training and encouraging the next generation of young people. So over and over. But I think, what I want to underscore is that she liked young people's militancy, and she would show up and be willing to support what they were doing. And as a middle-aged person, right, I learn a lot from that, right, that she would show up for young people's movements, not say, "Oh, I've been in the struggle for 30 years, I'm going to tell you what to do," but that she would be like, what you need me to do, I will be here.
You know, I think as part of my role as curator of Black history here at the Henry Ford is that I have a real opportunity to not only tell new stories, but to put a new eye on some stories that we thought we may have known a lot about. And I think for me, especially as a native Detroiter, a child of the 90s, child of the 2000s, you know, Mrs. Parks was always somebody who was here. She was both larger than life, but also like this, you know, oh, she's just a little old lady. And then you grow up and you start actually listening to what people are telling you, you know, as a young person who can't be told anything, right? And you start realizing that, you know, this lady is just such a force. She is so powerful. And I think one of the most important things that I think I will always remember as a young, really young person in 2005, watching the procession on 7 Mile, right, of Mrs. Parks. Well, first we had gone down. She was at State, lying in state at the Charles H. Wright Museum of African American History. I'm sure several of you were in those long lines. I think we were in line for 2 hours, waiting to pay our respects. And then walking with my mom and my sister down to the corner of 7 Mile and Schaefer and watching the procession come through, and just the hundreds of people that I could see in my neighborhood who were coming out and paying respect, not only just to a national face, but to our local mother in many ways. And so, Mrs. Aldridge, I want to again turn to you. In your sort of friendship with Mrs. Parks, what are some of the memories that you have of working with her, especially in the ways that she cultivated both you and Reverend Aldridge, especially in the wake of the 67 rebellion and the tribunal right after?
Well, first of all, oh my goodness, I want to say thank you as well to Dr. Jeanne, my friend now, I think so, because what has happened inadvertently is that, particularly with the distribution of the young people's book about the rebellious life of Mrs. Parks, that the young people are being engaged again. They're being engaged in seeing books. They being engaged in being involved in books. And I think that's a wonderful thing, and I want to say thank you for seeing to it that the book is distributed among young people, and I hope that continues. And certainly thank the Henry Ford for beginning to engage in conversations about the African American condition in this area. Last time of the Black History Month, the Henry Ford had a recipe about pancakes. They had gone into Mrs. Parks' archive and got that. And the recipe was unique because it had peanut butter in it. And so if you had this particular recipe of pancakes, and I'm not sure if this came about because of Mrs. Parks' being in the South, you know, in Alabama, or she also later on became a vegetarian. And so if you had these pancakes, that's a meal.
Yeah.
That's a meal. Pancakes with peanut butter, and that's a meal. I want to say also one other thing about the film that talks about colorism with Claudette Colvin. Claudette Colvin was 15 years. She was a teenager when she was arrested. And one of the things that made what happened to Emmett Till so devastating, other than his horrible treatment, and that was that he was a child. 14 years old in 1955 is a child. And so you wait on a more suitable person to represent the Montgomery bus boycott, and it had nothing or very little to do with Mrs. Parks' color. This morning they had a show on about Emmett Till as well, because Emmett Till was also murdered in 1955. There were a lot of things that went on in 1955. Emmett Till is killed. Claudette Colvin is arrested, and then the bus boycott begins as well in December 1st. And Joanne Robinson, and she was in the film, and we want to emphasize the role of the women that were around the bus boycott in November in Montgomery.
I mean, and just to add to that, like 4 days before she makes her bus dance on November 27th, 1955, she goes to this mass meeting because the lead organizer in the Emmett Till case, T.R.M. Howard, has come to Montgomery to bring the bad news that the two men who had lynched Emmett Till had just been acquitted, and then that another voting rights sort of organizer in the state had just been beaten, but to try to get people to keep the faith and keep going. So she talks about thinking about Emmett Till that day on the bus, and
Yes.
and partly that's because of, I mean, if we can think about Rosa Parks that, 4 nights earlier at that mass meeting, right? Emmett Till's, they had managed to get more attention for Emmett Till's lynching, and still those men walk free. And so for a longtime activist like Mrs. Parks, right? And the fact that this is a 14-year-old, boy, right? This is devastating. They're furious. They're exhausted. And so she's carrying Emmett Till on the bus that day, I think.
Yeah, when she was just finally said, I've had it.
Right.
No more.
No more.
Just no more. And I firmly also agree with that it just became too much. Now, the other thing, this morning there was a story on about Emmett's, and that's what his mother called him, and his mother, Mrs. Mobley, Mamie Till Mobley, became good friends to Mrs. Parks. I mean, partially, she was in Chicago, that was her hometown, and so it was easy for her to come over and participate in discussions and all kinds of things. So now they have a movement to buy the barn where Emmett Till was murdered. So someone is going to profit off of Emmett Till's murder. And the only thing we can do, and I firmly believe that Mrs. Parks would say, we have to keep going. We just have to keep going. There's so many things that are left to do, and so we have to grab our family, our extended family, our family, kin, and information gather and see what we have to do for the next step.
Because wherever we go, we're going together, right? Wherever we end up going in this fight, we go together. And I think Mrs. Parks kind of embodies this, this unique solidarity between not only just what she did in Montgomery on that one day in December, but also when she shows up for other people, for other movements, for other individuals, when she's reaching back to say, let me make sure that I'm in Selma, showing my face. Let me make sure that I'm in Detroit, showing my face. Not only just showing my face, but also putting in the work. Because it's not just enough to be an activist in sort of name only. It is a practice. It is a lived experience. And I think we often, as is mentioned in both the book and, of course, the documentary, was the level of violence and the risk that Mrs. Parks took in deciding that she was going to embody parts of this help birth this modern civil rights movement. The reason that she is brought to Detroit, the reason that why she and Mr. Parks come to Detroit is for their own safety. And I think what they realize is that Detroit isn't necessarily that much safer than other parts of the South. There's so many people who are coming up north. And I think, Dr. Theoharis, I know we've talked about it significantly, about the role that Detroit and other northern cities have in our collective memory, and oftentimes being left out of the conversation totally. Could you talk a little bit more about what's lost when we don't necessarily admit the fact that these big cities, Chicago, Detroit, New York, Boston, are also these havens for racism that sometimes, oftentimes, doesn't necessarily get washed out?
Right. I mean, I think, and I noticed people when the quote, when she gets to Detroit and she calls it the northern promised land that wasn't, right? That some of the signs of segregation are thankfully gone. But she says she doesn't find too much difference in the systems of school segregation, housing segregation, job discrimination, police brutality that she leaves in Montgomery, she finds in Detroit. Just to give a few examples, right? When they bring Mrs. Parks to Detroit, actually during the Montgomery bus boycott in 1956, no hotels, right, serve black people in Detroit, right? This is not just a problem in the South. Joe Muir's seafood, how if you were a black person, you had to go around the back and get your seafood wrapped in newspaper, right? So some of even the most iconic things that we associate with the South are happening here. And then I think, and I know this was true of me, when I first started the project, typically when we talk about Mrs. Parks in Detroit, it's sort of the last sentence, and then she moves to Detroit and sort of this implied, and then she lives happily ever after.
That's it.
Right? And that decade of suffering, right, after she loses her job in Montgomery, it's not, they don't get here and then everything's fine. That goes on, right? The kind of job discrimination, the kind of housing inequality and housing shortage, and that there's no decent, affordable place to rent. She writes Septima Clark at Highlander again and again about how expensive and how indecent the housing for black people is, how segregated the city is. But I think in our collective memory, it is easier to imagine kind of this southern problem, this regional anachronism, than to grapple with it as a national issue, as an issue we haven't solved, right? Because I think this kind of sepia-toned South makes it seem like we had this problem and we fixed it. And I think when we grapple with the second half of Mrs. Parks' life, right, in the northern promised land that wasn't, it's a more modern story. It's a story that confronts us today, right? To the end of her life, she's saying the struggle's not over, the movement isn't over, don't say the movement is over. Because I think to reckon with Mrs. Parks in Detroit is to reckon with sort of how much farther we have to go.
I was very gratified to see Mrs. Parks's niece today. And one thing, I hadn't seen her or them since they were children. And one of the things that Mrs. Parks was she loved her family. She loved those children. And she cared for those children. And so we were all forever, and I lived around the corner basically in Southwest Detroit from where they lived. And so it was easy for her to, come with me to Southwest Detroit. And she was forever, and one of her niece reminded me that we had a garden. I said, I know you had a garden, because we were forever going, getting seeds or getting things to go in the garden, and then take care of. Because Mrs. Parks took the responsibility of taking care of her brother and the children. There were 13 of them, and her mother and her, and basically also Mr. Parks. So she was busy caring for family, and that was quite well, she was happy to do it, but it was quite a burden for her.
Right.
Yeah, and that kind of leads into this idea that we kind of hint at in the documentary, and you dedicate quite a few pages in some of the final chapters of your book to this sort of Mrs. Parks, the myth, versus Mrs. Parks, the person. And I think, Mrs. Aldridge, you're definitely pulling back some of that mythology that we have as a collective around Mrs. Parks from where, oh, well, she was just a little old lady. Number one, she wasn't that old. She was in her 40s, so
No.
That's not that old. And two, she wasn't tired. The only thing she was tired of was being sick and tired, to quote
Yeah.
Fannie Lou Hamer, right? And so, I think where we sometimes struggle as a collective, even working at a history organization, is getting people to see beyond this one action of this person, which is obviously a very critical and important action, to see the full humanity, to see the full personhood of this woman who was more than just the mother of the movement. That's an important role for her, of course, but she's an aunt, she's a sister, she's a loved one. She's a woman of multiple facets, like we all are. And I think it would be critical for all of us to look deeper at our historical figures about these major powerhouses and look beyond just what is said in the narrative and look for their humanity.
Mm. Now, Mrs. Parks was also a person of deep spiritual caring. She was a faithful member of St. Matthew's CME Church. She went to Sunday school. She went to church. She was her parents, well, her mother at any rate, and she had cousins here in Detroit, and that's how she got to St. Matthew's CME Church, because her cousin. She lived with her cousin for a while, and her cousin took her to St. Matthew's. One of my dear friends who we just lost not too long ago, Al Hunter, said that was his job as a teenager to take Mrs. Parks to Sunday school. And while we're talking about, Ed Vaughn passed away. He would say that he joined the ancestors
Just a few weeks ago,
about
a month
or so
ago.
So, and he was, very supportive, as he said in the film about with Mrs. Parks, and was glad to see her. And she, like I said, she was a member of the CME Church, but she was not haughty about her particular faith. She was open to all religious ideas. And she was very, very close during a certain period of time to the Buddhists that were headquartered in Japan.
Exactly.
So she was a person of ideas and faith and ideas.
Right, right. And that kind of both and, right? That you can be a deep Christian and add Buddhist meditation and do yoga, right? That like...
Yeah, she was a yogi.
Yeah.
There's pictures of her in her practice.
Right, right. And similar with, again, we saw Joanne Watson in the film talking about the kind of, using the phrase, holistic, that she was holistic, that it could be Martin and Malcolm and Robert Williams and Mario Bedelli and Ella Baker and Septima Clark and Gloria Richardson and Queen Mother Moore, right? It's not...
Oh, yes.
Right? It's all. And so religiously, politically, right, that there's a kind of holisticness.
Yes. That's the kind of person Mrs. Parks was. Yes, indeed. She well-rounded and accepted all faiths and all groups. She didn't seem never to be treating anyone poorly. I never saw it in all the time that we were together. We traveled together, and she and I, and one of the times I met Dr. Martin Luther King, she was on the board of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference from 1955 on to probably to her death. She was there. So, and we were ushered into the room, Mrs. Parks and I. Mrs. King was standing at the head of the bed, and we went in talking and talked with him. And she believed in nonviolence, and that was the practice of Dr. King. And she may have studied, and I'm sure she did, some of what nonviolence meant to Dr. Martin Luther King.
Yeah.
So as we kind of come to a close for our conversation and get ready to open up to Q&A from the audience, I think it would be remiss if we don't mention a couple of things. One, we saw Dearborn in this documentary, didn't we?
Yes, we did.
Right? I think we can't forget where we are, whose name is on the building, and what all of that means, right? Where many of us in this room were not welcome, and I mean, arguably, aren't we welcome today? I don't know. But that's another conversation for another day. It would be remiss not to talk about that and the sort of skeletons in the closet that we as Detroiters, as community members, people who are students of history should be thinking about and should be bringing attention to. We're also 3 weeks after a major event in our collective organizing as citizens of this country. And, I think depending on, it doesn't matter what side of the political aisle you're on, I think it is a moment that a lot of people are stressing about, and rightfully so. But it's not the first time we've been in moments like this. We've seen that through this documentary over and over and over and over. And I think the last question that I want to pose to you both is that we're here in this moment, and where do we go from here? How do we take the lessons of solidarity, of sheer powerful will, a quiet strength that is never silent, right, that Mrs. Parks practiced in her life? How do we use her strategies to help us moving forward into an uncertain future together?
Well, I would say the power of family to her was very important. That you take your loved ones, your loved ones, your familiar family, and your extended family, and you treat them all the same. You treat them, you just use your faith, your understanding. But the point is to make and treat your neighbor as you would yourself. And then you can't go wrong that way. And she believed in the power of all of the loves. And she learned a lot of her lessons in kindergarten that took her throughout her life. Because they were devout churchgoers in Alabama. And her mother, took her to church, and her grandparents as well. So the simple license, the life lessons, it's nothing particularly mysterious about it. Learn information gathering, gather information and know what you're talking about. Read, and that's why I say it's so important to get these books out to the young people, the Rebellious Life. And so they have something to read, something concrete, something to touch. The whole thing about the garden, you touch, you feel, and you get involved. So it's just a lot to still do, and a lot for us to think about and not give up. Mm-hmm. Listen, we cannot be tired. We're no ways tired. We don't know where things are going to end, but we're taking lessons from the civil rights movement and what happened there. And somebody said about being sick and tired. Well, one of my favorite people in the whole wide world, also Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer, that was one of her things. I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. Right. So I got to keep on keeping on and keep on fighting the good fight. And I believe Mrs. Parks would do that.
Right. I mean, just to pick up on that and to kind of return us to December 1st, 1955, but to who Rosa Parks actually was on December 1st, 1955, which was someone who'd been an activist for more than 20 years. And we talk a lot about how courageous Mrs. Parks is, but I think what really makes that courageous that day is she's made stands before. Other people she knows have made stands before. There's nothing to suggest that making another stand on that day is going to do something. There's a lot to suggest that something bad could happen, and something bad does happen, right? And yet she does it, right? And so to me, the biggest lesson from Rosa Parks is that ability to just keep doing things, right? And you're not, I mean, if we think about those 60 years that you mentioned, right, that so much of that, she's not believing she's going to see that change in her lifetime that she's fighting for. But again, that night and so many other nights, right, it's just she talks about how if she got up, that would mean that she approved of this kind of treatment, and she did not approve, right? And so that sense of like, you do it and you do it again, and you're not going to know, right, that that's going to be a history-changing moment, right? But you do it again, right? And that's the courage to me that is, I mean, if I take a lesson from her, it's that.
Ladies, thank you. So I think we have time for a couple of questions. Matt, I'm not sure if I see you wandering around. Oh, there's a couple of folks walking around with microphones. If you have a particular question, raise your hand high so they can come over to you. So we have a couple here in the front.
One of the things I heard, and I don't know if it's true, is that there was other people also trained as far as what to do regarding if they were on the bus, as opposed to, doing something violent versus nonviolent. Was there other people involved in that were also, because I know you said from the movie, they were planning it for like 3 years, they were discussing all this?
So one of the things that Rosa Parks knows that day, right, is when they arrest Cleta Colvin is a very petite young woman. The cops put their hands all over her, and she struggles. And so they, as we saw in the film, they arrest her, not just on a segregation charge, but a disturbing the peace charge and an assaulting an officer charge. And so one of the things that Mrs. Parks does not do on that day, and I think it is because she learns both from what happens to Colvin, because the other thing, the film did not make this clear. When the judge hears Colvin's case, he throws out the segregation charge, he throws out the disturbing the peace charge. He only convicts her on the assault charge, which is going to make it harder to pursue a case against segregation with Colvin's case. So the judge is very tricky in this moment too. So Mrs. Parks, people, they learn, right? So they learn from Colvin's case. They also learn a decade earlier, a woman by the name of Viola White had refused to give up her seat and decided to pursue her legal case. In response, the police rape her daughter. And then they do this bureaucratic thing, which is that Viola White's appeal never gets heard. So part of why Fred Gray decides to proactively file in federal court is because they have learned that one of the tactics the state might take is to never hear Mrs. Parks' case on appeal. Just as she learns, right, she doesn't struggle that day. We do see her struggle when she gets mugged. Mrs. Parks is someone who believes in self-defense of her person, but she does not struggle that day at all. And so I think we do see her learn from what happens with Colvin. And so she doesn't, so I think this idea of her being trained, I think, is both true and inaccurate. And she's absolutely a 20-year activist. The Black community is absolutely growing more and more angry about bus segregation. The year before, right, when Brown versus Board happens, the Women's Political Council writes to the mayor and the bus company saying this needs to be desegregation on the bus as well, or we're going to boycott, right? So people are ready, but then there is also what it means to take a stand in that moment. And that's also, I think, many of us, to me, what makes Mrs. Parks so courageous is the ability to see a moment like that as a moment of opportunity. To use Reverend Vernon Johns, who's the pastor at Dexter before King, he says she caught a vision that night, right? So I think there's both learning and preparing, and then there's also, acting in the moment.
My question is, I agree with everything I've heard, and you're saying, we must educate ourselves, we must read, we must do all this. But a few weeks ago, something happened here, and it actually started happening before a few weeks ago, the banning of books.
Yes.
I am very concerned about that because most of the books that are being banned are books that tell the truth about history. I'm concerned about your book. Your book is very enlightening, and I'd like to not see it on one of the banned books in our libraries. Right. So that's my statement and my question.
So Mrs. Aldridge, she was asking stating about the banned book issue within our country and having concerns about the lack of access for this book, The Rebellious Life of Mrs. Parks, for not only just young people, but all people. Do you have any comment about the banned book situation?
Well, Dr. Harris has more than one version
Yep.
of her book. And, that was the first one, the hard copy.
Right.
And then now we have the new one that has the awards that
Right.
that the book and the film
Right.
won. And I spoke in particular about the young people's version.
Right.
And that's the one we really want, I think, now that's my opinion, want to get that out to young people. And all people, I didn't say young black people, I said young people.
Yeah.
Young people are crying for information, they're crying for inspiration. And I think the book helps with that. I do.
Right, and Zinn Education Project, which is named after Howard Zinn. If people are educators or no educators, and this can be educators in, you can be an after-school educator, or the Zinn Education Project is giving out copies for teachers so that they can read the book and bring it into their classrooms, but those can also be kind of freedom classrooms or after-school classrooms. So again, if you go to, we have a whole curriculum at Zinn Education Project, so people can go and look on the web. So if you go to Zinn Education Project, and then under their different campaigns, it's their different curriculum, it's the Rosa Parks tab. And there's also information about, if you're an educator, about how to get a copy of the young adult book.
Yeah, and
I mean, it's also sold in, Amazon and Barnes & Noble and
Sure.
any bookstore that you frequent, but.
Yeah, I think this is really the point where we can use some of the power that Mrs. Parks is demonstrating throughout her life, right? The buck stops with us, and we are the citizens that elect people who decide these things. We also have a voice, and we should be using it as often as possible to not just go quietly into the good night, but to be stomping loudly and bringing attention wherever possible to injustices such as not ensuring that our collective stories are being preserved and told for everybody's benefit, right? I think we have time for one more question. In the back, there we go.
Good afternoon. My name is Sharon Madison, and I knew Rosa Parks, Ed Vaughn, Joanne Watson, so many of the people that were in this film. I'm so grateful that it was done while they were still alive, because we lost so many of them in the last year. Joanne last year, Ed Vaughn a few weeks ago, Joe Madison a few weeks ago as well. And I think it's really important for us as Detroiters to understand how significant Detroit is. And the African proverb is that the hunt will always favor the hunter until the lion learns to write. And so we all must learn how to write and be able to tell the story. Now, the story of Detroit is being rewritten right now. And when I watched this film, it almost made me cry because of that, because I'm reminded of that. And it also reminded me of how significant and important an individual is. Rosa Parks, John Conyers, all the people in this country that could have helped Rosa Parks. John Conyers here in Detroit was the only one that really did. And so I think we should ask ourselves, how do we rewrite this history? How do we tell the story so that people really know what's going on? Thank you.
Thank you for that. I so appreciate that point, because, and especially for us to end on that point, because as we've been preparing for this panel and thinking about, well, how do we tell the story of the Black freedom struggle in Detroit?
Yes.
How do we tell that story here? How do we take a new look at our With Liberty and Justice exhibition, take a new look at our materials related to Mrs. Parks, the Montgomery Improvement Association, as we welcome in the Dr. Sullivan and Richie Jean Jackson home from Selma, Alabama that we open up in 2026. But we keep coming back to Detroit, and I don't know if you can, but I know I can't imagine a civil rights story without Black Detroit. I can't do it.
Right.
You
right.
can't do it. And it is so understated and oftentimes ignored, to your point, that we have to take a more active role in preserving our stories before those stories are gone. The only thing that is a guarantee to all of us is that time is going to keep moving, and we all won't be here at some point. And it's important for us to not only just write the story, tell our story, and make sure that the next generation has the torch to not only preserve the story and tell their story and add to our story, but to also make a line in the sand about what they will and will not take when it comes to the revision and outright ignoring of our collective story. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, once again, I would love you to thank our panel of distinguished guests. Dr. Jeanne Theoharis, Mrs. Dorothy Dewberry Aldridge, and I'd like to thank all of you for taking out a Sunday right after Thanksgiving to spend some time with us. I hope you learned a little bit more about Mrs. Parks, maybe a little bit more about Black Detroit. I invite you now to step into the museum and take a look at the bust if you haven't had a chance to. Definitely stop by and purchase a copy of The Rebellious Life of Rosa Parks, this brand new edition. At the end of everything, enjoy your holidays. Please be together in this season. And again, family is the most important. Family and the community that you build is so important right now. Thank you all for joining us. Have a good night.